What would you do if the enemy outside your walls was not just stronger, but willing to use tactics so brutal that even their own soldiers whispered about them in fear? Imagine standing at the top of a besieged city gate, watching the horizon darken not from storm clouds, but from the disciplined advance of Persian generals whose reputations traveled faster than their armies. When ancient chronicles speak of siege warfare, they often describe numbers, weapons, and strategies. But hidden beneath those accounts is something far more disturbing: the psychological cruelty that defined the Persian approach to cities that dared resist. This is where the true horror begins, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when defenders realized the Persians were not coming to negotiate, but to reshape the fate of everyone behind those walls. Picture the scene. The sun is setting, the streets inside the city are filled with fear, and the distant rumble of marching boots becomes a reminder that the empire surrounding you has perfected the art of forcing surrender without lifting a sword. Persian generals understood something terrifying about human nature. They knew that suffering, when calculated with precision, could bend entire populations before the first strike. They used prisoners as warnings, staged displays of punishment that carried across the walls, and manipulated the air itself with symbols of doom. People inside the city would watch, unable to intervene, as the Persians demonstrated exactly what awaited them. It was not simply warfare, it was psychological dismantling. And yet, as you lean over the battlement, there is a second layer to this story that is rarely told. Even among the Persian ranks, among seasoned soldiers who had witnessed countless campaigns, there were murmurs of unease. Some acts ordered by their own commanders left them pale, shaken, and questioning the very empire they served. These soldiers carried out orders because they had no choice, but what they saw, what they were forced to participate in, carved shadows into their memories. When your own warriors fear your methods, the world begins to understand the scale of brutality you command. This is the forgotten truth behind Persian sieges, a truth that sets the tone for everything that follows. What happened outside the walls was only the beginning, and the stories buried in ancient accounts reveal a pattern of terror designed to break cities long before the gates collapsed. Before we go deeper into the hidden strategies and the silent cruelty that shaped the ancient world, tell me what you think about this opening. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how psychological warfare shaped history. Make sure to like this video to help bring these lost stories to light, and check whether you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because the next pieces of this narrative will take us further into the shadows of these forgotten sieges as the story continues. What follows after that first chilling moment on the battlements is the realization that Persian siege warfare was not improvised brutality, but a disciplined system engineered to break cities with almost mathematical precision. The generals who commanded these operations were not driven by rage or impulse. They were strategists shaped by an imperial doctrine that understood the psychology of resistance as deeply as the mechanics of war. Once the city saw their arrival, the process shifted into an unsettling rhythm, a step-by-step dismantling of morale that began long before the first catapult was positioned or the first arrow was drawn. The Persians knew that fear traveled faster than soldiers, and so they built their siege operations around that principle, turning human emotion into a weapon as sharp as any blade. The first tactic was isolation. Persian commanders made sure the besieged population understood that no reinforcements were coming, no allies were near, and no secret passages would save them. They blocked roads, patrolled surrounding valleys, seized water sources, and positioned units in places visible from the walls, signaling that escape was impossible. Inside the city, food stores were carefully rationed, and every citizen felt the creeping sense of time tightening around their throats. The Persians wanted this feeling to spread, to seep into every home and every conversation, because hunger and uncertainty did more damage than any siege tower could. But isolation alone was never enough. The Persian generals followed it with a second stage, one designed to crush the spirit of the defenders from the outside. They erected displays of captured fighters from earlier skirmishes, often placing them in sight of the city gates, not to kill them immediately, but to let their suffering speak louder than any threat. These scenes were arranged with cold calculation, ensuring that families and friends inside the walls would recognize faces, clothing, or voices. It was a message crafted with disturbing precision. This is what happens to those who resist the empire. Then came the auditory assault. Soldiers marched in shifting patterns, drums echoed at irregular intervals, and horns sounded at unexpected hours. None of it was meant to coordinate attacks. It was meant to rob the defenders of sleep, to create a rhythm of dread that kept the entire city on edge. The Persians had learned through centuries of conquest that exhaustion makes people irrational, and irrational people surrender faster. Yet the most unsettling part of this strategy was how organized it was. Nothing happened randomly. Every torch placement, every patrol route, every psychological blow was part of a larger choreography. The generals understood that cities rarely fell because their walls were breached. They fell because the people behind those walls lost the will to keep fighting. And as the hours stretched into days, and days into weeks, the defenders began to realize that the Persians were not just laying siege to their walls, they were laying siege to their minds. This was only the beginning of what the Persians considered necessary to force an entire population into submission. And the next phase would take their methods into even darker territory as their psychological pressure shifted toward breaking the city from within, one silent moment at a time. As the days stretched on, and the city realized the siege was not simply a test of endurance but a calculated dismantling of their resolve, the next layer of Persian strategy came into focus. Their generals understood that fear could weaken a city, but doubt could destroy it from the inside. So they turned their attention from the walls to the minds of those who guarded them, introducing methods so subtle and insidious that the defenders often did not realize they were being manipulated until it was too late. Persian commanders deployed psychological tactics crafted not to shock outright but to erode confidence piece by piece until the city felt as though its own thoughts were turning against it. The first step was information control. Persian scouts intercepted messengers, spread rumors among nearby villages, and even released captured soldiers back into the city after whispering carefully crafted lies to them. These returning prisoners, shaken and hungry, often carried stories designed to destabilize leadership. Claims that high-ranking Persian generals were negotiating with rival factions inside the walls, or that traitors had already promised to open the gates, circulated rapidly. None of it needed to be true. It only needed to be believable, and in the anxious climate of a siege, everything felt believable. The second tactic targeted unity. Persian commanders understood that a united city was nearly impossible to break, so they sowed seeds of distrust among defenders by staging events meant to appear accidental. Fires set at night near specific neighborhoods hinted at sabotage from within. Food supplies that mysteriously disappeared suggested corruption among the elite. At times, Persian archers would deliberately shoot arrows into the city, carrying messages accusing certain families or council members of collaboration. These accusations were often vague, but their ambiguity made them more dangerous. Suspicion flourished in the shadows left by unanswered questions. The generals also used silence as a weapon. Days would pass with no Persian movement, no drumbeats, no displays of cruelty, nothing except the watchers on the walls, staring into what felt like an unnatural calm. The defenders never knew whether this quiet meant retreat or preparation for horrors yet unseen. That uncertainty gnawed at them, creating a tension that tightened with every quiet hour. The Persians mastered the timing of this silence, withdrawing just long enough for the city to breathe before resuming their pressure at the worst possible moment. And then there were the whispers. These came not from Persian soldiers, but from merchants, wanderers, or prisoners who slipped near the walls at dusk, speaking of cities that surrendered early and were spared, while those that resisted suffered unspeakable consequences. The ambiguity of these stories made them more dangerous than direct threats. People trapped inside the city began to wonder whether their suffering was pointless, whether the stubbornness of their leaders was sentencing them to a fate worse than defeat. By now, the Persians had woven a psychological net so tight that even the most loyal defenders felt its pull. Leadership faltered as factions argued, trust eroded as doubts multiplied, and the unity that once held the city together began to fracture. And as these cracks spread across the population, the Persian generals prepared to introduce methods far more visible and far more terrifying, shaping the siege into something even their own soldiers could barely stomach. As the story deepens, as the psychological fractures widened inside the besieged city, the Persian generals shifted to the next stage of their strategy, a phase designed not just to weaken resolve, but to break it publicly and irrevocably. What came next was not subtle, not hidden behind rumor or silence. It was a controlled spectacle of suffering, engineered to be witnessed from every tower and every narrow street, forcing the defenders to confront what awaited them if they continued to resist. The Persians understood that fear could be whispered, but terror had to be shown. And so they began their demonstrations with a precision that turned cruelty into a form of communication. The first display was always the prisoners. Those captured during early skirmishes were dragged into the open field just close enough for the city to see the details of what was done to them. Persian generals selected punishment techniques carefully, choosing methods that prolonged suffering without killing too quickly. Limbs were broken in specific ways that forced the victims to remain conscious. Torture frames were erected at angles that caught the sunlight, so the shadows stretched across the plain like warnings carved into the earth. Every movement of those prisoners became a message, every scream a reminder that the empire outside the walls held complete control over their fate. But the Persians did something even more chilling. They forced their own soldiers to participate in acts that pushed the limits of their obedience. These men, hardened by campaigns across continents, found themselves carrying out orders that made them avert their eyes afterward. Some were instructed to parade mutilated prisoners near the walls, to walk slowly so the population inside could see the bodies swaying with each step. Others were tasked with staging mock executions, raising blades but stopping just before the fatal blow, leaving the defenders unsure of what they had witnessed. The psychological dissonance created by these scenes was deliberate. The unpredictability magnified the terror. Then came the executions meant to be unmistakably real. Persians had perfected a technique of punishment meant to signify not merely death, but utter domination. Victims were chosen carefully, leaders, scouts, or any figure whose capture would crush morale. They were bound to stakes or tied to siege equipment positioned directly in the defenders' line of sight. The generals made sure each act was slow and methodical, drawing out the agony long enough that the city had time to gather at the walls, time to watch, time to imagine themselves in the same place. Even more disturbing were the displays arranged at night. Torch lines formed circles around the victims, illuminating the suffering in a way that made every movement visible even from distant towers. The flickering flames cast monstrous shadows that crawled up the walls like warnings written in fire. Inside the city, children cried, elders prayed, and soldiers who once stood proudly now clenched their fists as their confidence dissolved. The The Persians never shouted threats. They didn't need to. The scenes unfolding in the firelight spoke more clearly than words ever could. What made this phase of the siege so devastating was not only the cruelty itself, but the realization that the Persians treated it as routine, part of the machinery of conquest rather than an exception. Their generals made no attempt to hide what they were capable of. They wanted the defenders to see everything, to feel the weight of inevitability pressing against their walls. If you've ever imagined how public fear shapes the fate of entire societies, or wondered what people truly felt as these brutal displays unfolded before their eyes, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds depth to these forgotten stories as the narrative continues. What the defenders often did not realize, at least not until it was too late, was that the Persians had a hierarchy of suffering. Ordinary prisoners were displayed to weaken morale, but leaders, commanders and nobles who resisted the empire were treated with a level of precision that revealed an unsettling truth. Persian generals believed that breaking a city required breaking its symbols first. The fate reserved for these figures was not simply death, it was transformation. Turning them into living lessons meant to echo through the city's collective memory. When a high-ranking defender was captured, Persian troops brought him before the general's tent, not to negotiate, but to begin a ritualized process of dismantling his authority. These men were forced to stand in the open, while their armor was removed piece by piece, each metal plate falling to the ground like fragments of lost power. The Persians made certain the city could see this moment, placing the captive in elevated positions or in clear lines of sight from the walls. The stripping of armor became symbolic, a visual statement that the figure once responsible for protecting his people could not even protect himself. But the Persians went further. They forced these leaders to confront the suffering of their own captured soldiers. Commanders were led past the torture frames, past the moaning prisoners, past the horrors arranged earlier for the entire city to witness. They were made to walk slowly, surrounded by guards who ensured their eyes remained open. In this way, the Persians weaponized guilt, forcing leaders to see the consequences of their decisions and planting doubt deep in their minds. A leader who had once radiated confidence now walked trembling, stripped not only of rank but of certainty. Once this psychological dismantling was complete, the final stage began. Persian generals were meticulous in selecting the method of punishment, ensuring that the symbolic weight matched the leader's status. Some were bound to towering stakes painted in vivid colors, so the entire city could distinguish them from ordinary captives. Others were tied to siege engines, their bodies forced into agonizing positions that made every shift of the machinery twist bone and sinew. These devices were placed strategically near the outer walls, so that even the faintest movement drew the attention of those watching from within. The most haunting detail was how long these punishments were designed to last. Persian records suggest that the generals believed prolonged suffering carried more impact than immediate execution, so the leaders were given just enough water to survive a little longer, their fate stretching into days that blurred together under the unrelenting sun. At night, the city could hear their voices carried by the wind, the cries softened but unmistakably human, reminding everyone inside that the empire was dismantling their defenders piece by piece. And yet, the Persians rarely gloated. There were no theatrical speeches, no triumphant proclamations. Their silence made the spectacle more terrifying. It suggested that this was not vengeance or rage, but procedure, an imperial system designed to crush resilience as efficiently as battering rams crushed stone. The message was unmistakable. If this is what we do to your leaders, imagine what awaits those who follow them. Inside the city, the effect was immediate. Some began urging surrender, terrified by the possibility of sharing the same fate. Others clung to hope, believing resistance still mattered. But beneath the surface, the city's unity was crumbling as fear and despair seeped into every household. And while the defenders grappled with the emotional fallout of what they had witnessed, the Persian generals were already preparing the next phase of their siege, one that would expose an even darker truth about how empires maintained power as the story deepens. What the city could not see from behind its walls was that the Persians were waging a second, unintended battle within their own ranks. As the punishments intensified and the displays grew more elaborate, many soldiers began to crack under the weight of what they were ordered to perform. It was one thing to march against enemies in open combat, another entirely to stand beside screaming prisoners whose agony stretched from sunrise to sunset. Persian generals had crafted these spectacles as tools of conquest, but the horrors they engineered seeped into the minds of their own men, creating fractures that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Veteran soldiers were often the first to recognize the shift. These were men who had survived years of campaigns, had marched across deserts and mountains, had seen bodies piled on battlefields, yet even they found themselves averting their eyes when ordered to participate in rituals designed to prolong suffering rather than end it. Some tried to harden themselves, reminding their subordinates that this was the way of empire, that conquest demanded obedience. But the truth was harder to suppress. The cruelty the generals demanded was unlike anything most of them had encountered before. The strain revealed itself in small ways at first. Soldiers lingered longer than necessary near supply carts, avoiding assignments that required escorting prisoners. Others grew restless at night, unable to sleep as the muffled cries of tortured captives drifted across the camp. In some units, arguments broke out between those who felt obligated to enforce the general's orders and those whose stomachs churned at the thought of carrying them out. The Persians prided themselves on discipline, but discipline wavered when confronted with suffering so deliberate and so relentless. Generals recognized this tension, but chose not to address it directly. Instead, they tightened control, reinforcing hierarchy with rigid commands and punishing even the smallest sign of hesitation. Soldiers who faltered were reassigned to tasks even more difficult, as if forced. Exposure to cruelty would desensitize them. In some cases, this strategy worked. Men grew numb, their expressions hollow as they went about their duties. But for others, the opposite occurred. Every new display chipped away at their loyalty, leaving them questioning not just the siege, but the empire itself. Rumors spread quietly among the lower ranks. Stories circulated about commanders who enjoyed the suffering they inflicted, men whose calm demeanor during the worst punishments unsettled even their closest officers. Others whispered about omens, interpreting the cries of the dying as warnings from disgraced spirits. These murmurs were dangerous, and the generals knew it, yet suppressing them entirely proved impossible as long as their own methods continued to haunt their soldiers. At night, the atmosphere inside the camp grew oppressive. Torches flickered against tents, where men lay awake, staring at the canvas above them as if the shapes in the shadows might speak. Some claimed they could still hear voices after the displays were over, echoes that lingered long after the last tortured breath had faded. Whether imagined or real, the effect was the same. Soldiers began to dread the morning not because of the enemy behind the walls, but because of the orders they might receive from their own commanders. The city, trapped in fear, believed the Persians were unified and unshakable. But the truth was far more complex. Beneath the empire's disciplined exterior, the generals were presiding over a quiet corrosion. Their methods were breaking the defenders, yes, but they were also wearing down the very men who enforced them. And as the siege dragged on, this internal strain created a volatile tension that threatened to erupt at any moment. setting the stage for what the generals would unleash next, pushing the entire conflict into even darker territory as the story continues. As the siege stretched into its second week, a strange shift occurred. The city's walls, battered by psychological and physical pressure, were now mirrored by unease in the Persian ranks. Even seasoned soldiers, trained to obey without question, began exchanging furtive glances when ordered to participate in increasingly elaborate punishments. It was as if the general's own methods, once a symbol of absolute power, had begun to shock even those who executed them. The terror designed to conquer the city had started to seep inward, creating moments of doubt and hesitation within the army itself. Persian commanders noticed the subtle cracks, but chose to escalate. They introduced new forms of intimidation meant to reinforce control, while simultaneously reminding their men of the empire's reach. Soldiers were now tasked with carrying out punishments in close proximity to their peers, ensuring that hesitation was visible to those around them. Anyone who faltered faced reassignment to the harshest duties, guarding prisoners in the blistering sun, hauling heavy siege equipment, or delivering messages to the city that required them to witness firsthand the agony of those captured. The generals believed exposure would instill resilience, but in many cases it produced fear, moral conflict, and silent rebellion in the hearts of the men. Inside the city, the defenders watched this intricate dance unfold, unaware that the same fear shaping their resolve was spreading to the very forces outside the gates. The Persians' reputation for ruthless efficiency remained intact, but the soldiers tasked with enacting it could not help but question the methods they were executing. Some murmured to one another about the cruelty of their orders, comparing notes on what had been done to prisoners and what they were being asked to do next. Others walked away from the scenes, hands trembling, hearts racing, as they witnessed acts that even the hardest of men struggled to accept. The generals, however, saw these reactions as minor distractions, confident that fear alone would maintain obedience. Yet as each day passed, both defenders and attackers began to realize that the siege was no longer simply a test of physical endurance. It had evolved into a battle of minds, a contest where uncertainty, guilt, and terror were weapons wielded more effectively than catapults or arrows. Leaders in the city felt the pressure mounting, while Persian soldiers felt the weight of responsibility for acts they had long been trained to carry out without question. The boundary between victim and perpetrator blurred, and the line separating conqueror from observer began to vanish under the oppressive shadow of empire. Some of the generals, aware of the psychological tension, adjusted their methods. They staged punishments at night, using firelight and shadows to exaggerate suffering. They rotated duties among units so that every soldier would witness horrors firsthand, forcing complicity and reinforcing control through fear and experience. These measures ensured that obedience was not just commanded but internalized, a chilling combination of loyalty and dread that would make any deviation seem impossible. If you've ever considered the cost of obedience and the subtle ways fear can infiltrate even those tasked with enforcing it, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your perspective deepens our understanding of how power manipulates both the victim and the executor, and it helps uncover the hidden dimensions of history as the siege story continues. As the siege progressed, the Persian generals began to implement what could only be described as a doctrine of silent terror, a methodical system designed to maintain absolute dominance over the city's population. Every movement, every sound, and every human reaction inside the walls was accounted for in their calculations. They recognized that long-term obedience could not rely solely on brute force or spectacular punishments. It required a pervasive, invisible pressure that infiltrated daily life. Soldiers and city inhabitants alike were trapped in a meticulously controlled environment where every glance, gesture, and word contributed to a growing atmosphere of inevitability. The generals employed subtle intimidation that required minimal action yet exerted maximal psychological effect. Siege engines were positioned so that shadows from their arms fell across narrow streets at dawn and dusk, stretching the perception of time and emphasizing the presence of the Persian force even when no movement occurred. Scouts were visible from the walls at irregular intervals, sometimes appearing to retreat, only to return with renewed precision, instilling a constant uncertainty about the army's numbers and positioning. This manipulation of perception created a city in which residents could no longer trust their senses, a living reminder that their environment had been co-opted by an empire capable of turning reality itself into a weapon. Inside the walls, rumors and strategic leaks were carefully cultivated. Persian agents, often disguised as traders or messengers, would enter neighborhoods, spreading stories of cities that had resisted and faced total annihilation. Families were confronted with conflicting accounts, some claiming mercy, others describing horrors so vivid that listeners struggled to separate fact from fear. The result was a population in which trust eroded, decision-making faltered, and the leaders struggled to maintain cohesion. The generals understood that the perception of power could achieve what direct assault sometimes could not, and they leveraged this insight with ruthless efficiency. Even soldiers executing the orders felt the weight of the empire's meticulous planning. They were not merely following commands. They were instruments in a psychological network that spanned the city, designed to collapse resistance before the gates were even breached. Every action taken by the Persians was designed to maximize tension, positioning prisoners so their suffering could be seen but not touched, timing patrols to unsettle the defenders' routines, orchestrating the movement of siege engines to create the illusion of omnipresence. The effect was cumulative, producing an atmosphere of relentless oppression that drained morale and sharpened fear with each passing day. The culmination of these strategies was a city forced to anticipate its own destruction. The defenders were compelled to calculate every choice under the shadow of what they might witness next. Every decision carried the potential for immediate consequences, and the line between survival and death became a constant consideration. Within the Persian camp, commanders observed silently, noting reactions, adjusting tactics, and refining the methods that had already proven so effective. Their approach transformed the siege into a continuous feedback loop. The city's fear informed the general's next actions, and each new tactic deepened the psychological hold, ensuring that by the time the walls faced the first physical assault, resistance had already begun to crumble internally. The next phase, already in preparation, would escalate this invisible control into direct, terrifying confrontation as the generals prepared to force the city to confront its final choice, testing obedience, fear, and survival in ways that would push both soldiers and citizens toward the brink. As the siege approached its climax, the Persian generals shifted focus from psychological manipulation to the tangible, physical destruction that would leave an unmistakable imprint on the city and its inhabitants. Every act of violence, every dismantled structure, and every burned household was calculated to communicate a single message: resistance was futile, and the empire's reach was absolute. The walls that had once offered security became instruments of despair, their towers casting long shadows over streets cleared of trust and hope. This was not indiscriminate chaos. It was a systematic method of turning destruction into a language, a symbol the city could not ignore. The generals orchestrated targeted demolitions designed for maximum psychological impact. Key buildings, government offices, granaries, and elite residences were leveled in carefully staged sequences, ensuring that their collapse could be observed from multiple vantage points within the city. These structures were not chosen at random. Each one represented authority, organization, or social cohesion, and their destruction sent a clear signal that the foundations of leadership were within the empire's control. Civilians were forced to witness the devastation, understanding that the very symbols of their community were under siege, eroding the collective belief in safety, stability, and survival. Beyond buildings, the Persians used the city's own infrastructure against it. Aqueducts, wells, and storage facilities were sabotaged, making water scarce and food supplies unreliable. The intent was twofold: to weaken physical resistance and to instill the belief that survival was no longer a certainty. Generals ensured that these actions were visible, often timing them so that residents would hear the rush of destroyed channels or the collapse of walls, audible reminders that the empire dictated every heartbeat within the city. Fear was compounded with helplessness, producing a calculated psychological collapse alongside the physical destruction. This display extended to the city's streets and marketplaces, where carefully choreographed patrols and punitive measures were enacted. Shops and homes of prominent figures were ransacked, their contents scattered or destroyed, creating a public theater of dominance. Those who attempted to intervene were captured or driven back, reinforcing the perception that Persian authority was inescapable. By turning familiar spaces into sites of terror, the generals ensured that even routine movement within the city became an exercise in caution, paranoia, and submission. Soldiers in the Persian ranks observed the effects with clinical detachment, aware that their actions were as much about teaching fear as about enforcing conquest. Each ruin, each burned structure, and each act of destruction carried a message not only to the city but also to neighboring regions. Defiance would meet with absolute and precise retaliation. Civilians internalized this message quickly, understanding that the empire's power was not abstract but immediate, omnipresent, and capable of controlling life and death at will. By the end of these orchestrated devastations, the city's social fabric was shredded. Families, leaders, and communities were fractured, leaving the population vulnerable not only to siege but to the psychological dominance of their conquerors. The generals had communicated everything they intended without a single unnecessary word. Obedience was the only path to survival, and resistance guaranteed suffering. As the city teetered on the edge of final submission, the Persians prepared the ultimate act, one that would seal the empire's message in a way that history would struggle to erase, setting the stage for the final chapter of terror in this unfolding narrative. The city, now hollowed by fear, deprivation, and relentless pressure, faced the ultimate moment. Persian generals, having exhausted every psychological and physical tactic, prepared for the final confrontation, one designed not only to complete the siege, but to engrave their dominance into memory for generations. Streets that had once thrived with commerce and life were now silent, shadows stretching across rubble as the remaining defenders gathered their strength for what they hoped might be one last stand. But the Persians had anticipated every move, calculated every hesitation, and their methodical approach left the city with only two possible outcomes: total compliance or the obliteration of its structure and spirit. As the first waves of assault crossed the threshold, it was clear that the defenders' morale had already been fractured beyond repair. The soldiers stationed on the walls, exhausted by days of tension, sleepless nights, and the harrowing sights of punishment, faltered under even minor pressure. Generals monitored every reaction, noting where resistance lingered, where doubt had taken root, and where sheer terror had already done the work of conquest. Their strategy had succeeded in a way far more effective than simple force could ever have achieved. The city was conquered without relying solely on weapons, and the empire had imposed its rule on hearts and minds before the final gates even fell. Every corner of the city told a story of deliberate subjugation. Families huddled in what remained of their homes. Leaders were paraded and humiliated, and the remaining population understood that survival depended on immediate compliance. The Persians established order quickly and efficiently, converting chaos into governance, fear into obedience. They left symbols of the empire's power scattered throughout the city, burned buildings, captured flags, and meticulously arranged prisoners to reinforce the lesson that defiance had consequences. In this final stage, the psychological machinery merged seamlessly with the physical, creating an environment where the presence of the empire was omnipresent and inescapable. Yet even amidst the destruction, there were fragments of resilience. Some individuals whispered stories of endurance, shared hidden supplies, or offered comfort to neighbors, small acts that hinted at the enduring spirit of humanity despite calculated oppression. The Persians, while meticulous in their methods, had inadvertently highlighted the contrast between the human instinct to survive and the empire's desire to dominate completely. These moments, fleeting as they were, became silent testaments to the very lives the generals sought to control. As the dust settled and the city adapted to its new reality, the lesson of the siege extended far beyond the walls. Persian generals had demonstrated that mastery over an empire was not measured solely by victories in battle, but by the ability to manipulate fear, obedience, and perception. Their approach transformed war into an instrument of total control, leaving behind a record of suffering, submission, and survival that would echo long after the smoke cleared. If you've followed this story to the end, take a moment to reflect and leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," or share your thoughts on the psychological depths of historical sieges. Don't forget to like this video if you found value in uncovering these forgotten strategies, and make sure you're subscribed so you can continue exploring the hidden truths of history with us. There's a next story waiting to challenge your perception of power, and I want you to continue with me into the next chapter.